This first session is designed to look at the particular ways that institutions of higher learning participate in discussions about how we talk about feeding the world. So the speakers are, and I'll introduce all three of them, and then Maggie, I think we'll start with you. Maggie Adamek has worked in the development of sustainable food systems for over 15 years, much of it within a land-grant university context. She served as a chair of a Kellogg-funded food systems profession education initiative. She's published peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and conference presentations on the role and paradigms of land-grant universities associated with feeding the public and food production. Her most recent role at the University of Minnesota was as Local Foods Research Fellow for the Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships. And she remains an affiliate faculty member for the University Center for Rural Design. Claire Henricks is a professor of rural sociology at Pennsylvania State University, where her research, teaching, and outreach activities center on sustainable agriculture, environmental change, and community development. Her recent work includes Hope and Skepticism, Farmer and Local Community Views on Socioeconomic Benefits of Agricultural Bioenergy, and Moving Local Food Through Conventional Food System Infrastructure, Value Chain Framework Comparisons and Insights. And Richard Wilk is a professor of anthropology and a faculty associate of the Anthropological Center for Training and Research on Global Environmental Change at Indiana University. His research interests range from modern beauty pageants and the spread of ancient Olmec society, the shortcomings of rational choice theory and the history of Belizean cuisine, to moral talk about television and the global branding of bottled water. Recent publications include Time Consumption in Everyday Life, Practice, Materiality, and Culture, and Anchovy Sauce and Pickled Tripe, Exporting Civilized Food in the Colonial Atlantic World. So I think without further ado, I will turn the floor or the table over to you, Maggie.
Thank you. It's really exciting to see all of you here, and I thought since I was going to go first that I might provide a little bit of a bigger picture context about the land-grant university and food and feeding people, and then talk a bit about the institutional framework. For those of you who aren't familiar with what a land-grant university is, in 1862 Congress passed what's called the Morrill Act. The idea was at the time that the states that existed were to receive a tract of land from the federal government, which they could then sell, and the proceeds from that sale could be used to build a university for the people. At the time, higher education was the province of the highly educated. Schools were private. Almost all of them tended to be affiliated with a religious institution. Most of them obviously were located in the eastern part of the United States. And so the idea that Justin Morrill and his congressional colleagues had was that education, part of democracy is that education should be accessible to all. And at the time, of course, most people were living in a rural context. There were city dwellers, but the bulk of folks were situated in rural environments, most of them involved with subsistence level farming as the primary way of feeding themselves and their families. The idea of the land grant was not only to serve this broader public, but it existed with three design principles. One was to provide vocational training for the American populace so that they could contribute to the economy. The second principle was that it provided a civic education so people would become effective citizens as in the democracy. So they had the training they needed, vocational skills to make a living. They had the civic skills they needed to be informed citizens, to exercise their rights and engagement in a democracy. And the third underpinning was associated with the liberal education. So what did it take to be an educated person? What were the basic sort of skills that you needed to be an educated and informed citizen? And so it was those three design principles that led to the initial sort of formulation of what people would be educated like at a land-grant university. Shortly after the turn of the 20th century, Congress passed legislation that formed the Extension Service with the idea that it wasn't just students that had to come to campus to learn how to be farmers, that there needed to be some kind of integration of research and then technical training of people who were already farming so that they could become better farmers, that they could appropriate technology that would make them more efficient, that would increase their income, et cetera. And so the Cooperative Extension Service was founded not only to educate farmers, but also to educate farm wives in some of what we call the art of homemaking. So it was the food production side as well as the food consumption side and the homemaking side as well. And so Extension served this broad set of functions for a long time. So that's kind of the general scope of why the land-grant universities were founded, and now you find them in every state. Most states have two kinds of public universities: the research university that has their medical school, their dental school, their law school, etc., their professional schools, and then they have their land-grant university that deals with veterinary medicine, what we used to call home economics, the ag and food sciences, and natural resources. In the case of the University of Minnesota, we're both. We're a dual hybrid institution. We're both Minnesota's level 1 research university that has all those professional education functions. We're also our land-grant university, and we're one of the few land-grant universities in the country that's located in an urban setting. There's typically 3 parts of the land-grant mission. The first one is research, the second one is teaching, and the other one is called outreach, and in more contemporary terms, people call it oftentimes engagement, so that kind of civic interplay and partnership that the institution has with the public to produce something for the public good. So you look at these design principles of the land grant, this idea of vocational education, this idea of civic education, and then the idea of a liberal education, you start to see a few things begin to manifest. And as the land-grant university evolved toward the middle of the 20th century, during post-war there was a huge investment in agricultural research that the federal government made in kind of a post-war context. And it really upped the game of what agriculture became. It played a key role in moving from the kind of farm my dad grew up on, where there was an outhouse and a smokehouse, and my grandparents didn't get electricity till the early 60s, to an agriculture that became fairly sophisticated. It was mechanized, it involved less hand labor, you didn't need as many kids to just run the subsistence level farm that you needed. Things really changed quite a bit, and agricultural research at land-grant universities played a large role in reimagining the practice of agriculture. What that meant is it freed the farm labor, and people like my father who got a college education, he said, do I become a teacher or do I work really hard and stay cold? And he chose to, he was the first one to leave the farm, and a lot of people in that generation did. They got this access to education and the opportunities to become middle class in that post-war era and the kind of New Deal era gave people a lot of flexibility and opportunities, and many people left rural communities to seek an education and develop a livelihood and subsist in a middle class. So as we saw that rapid transformation in rural culture and the role that land-grant universities played in educating that population and changing the options, the lifestyle and economic options that they had, as I said, we saw this parallel experience in the way that agriculture was practiced. Now, when we look at the style of education, because of this emphasis on vocational education, what you saw particularly in the agriculture and what we might call the A&M or the A&T functions of land-grant universities, agricultural and technical or agricultural and mechanical, what we saw is a particular paradigm about how learning worked. And that came out of the Viennese tradition of how vocational education was formulated. And the idea there, it was based on this mechanistic paradigm that the ideal way to train somebody vocationally was through this sort of productivist, that efficiency was prized, that productivity was prized, that things were configured to streamline. And agricultural education was no exception to that. So as agriculture was reformulated under the idea that if you increase productivity, you increase farmer profits, and the way to increase productivity is to mechanize, do research on plant germplasm that increases yields. Of course, chemical inputs became part of the scenario in agricultural production, mechanized irrigation systems and the like. What you saw is this rapid increase in productivity, which was reflected in the underlying value of this kind of productivist paradigm. And you saw the same set of values happening in the style in which this vocational education was designed at land-grant universities. So it wasn't just that farming changed. The idea of how you educated people to be farmers or in careers related, vocations related to agriculture, also changed in terms of the formulation. The other piece you saw in the early 20th century was to really figure out what our methodologies are to study agriculture and food production. So there were two sort of contesting narratives about the purpose of extension and the way that you conducted extension research. One of which was developed by a guy named Seaman Knapp. He was famous for developing the sort of plot level research that a lot of agricultural scientists use now to study crop productivity and other cropping systems questions. And the other one was a little bit of a more holistic model by Liberty Hyde Bailey, who was on the faculty at Cornell a number of decades ago, who really saw the function of extension not to provide technology transfer by doing plot-based research, find the findings, extend them to the farmer, ask the farmer to comply with the findings, but to say that the function of something like extension was to really build democracy in rural communities. And how is it that we design outreach and extension programs that play primarily a democratic function rather than an economic function? Knapp's paradigm won out, and this idea of extension playing this role in technology transfer and to build the economic base of farmers is something that we see that persists today, both in terms of the style and the design of how agricultural science research is conducted, but also in terms of the priorities and commitments of a lot of scientists who go into the agricultural sciences who feel a strong commitment to building the economy of rural communities and see their role not just as maybe being a plant breeder related to corn and soybeans, but also as developing the economic base of rural communities. So when you talk to a lot of faculty, for example, in the agronomy and plant genetics department here at the University of Minnesota, while their focus might be in the lab or in the field on a particular plant or a particular plant-related problem or question, what they will tell you is the research that they're doing is not just about feeding people, it's about building the economic base of farming communities and maintaining that commitment and seeing their role in terms of contributing to a healthy democracy is to contribute to the livelihood and the economic profitability of rural communities. And that's something you hear from a lot of folks as researchers, but also as educators, where they feel their role is to produce graduates who can go and make a decent living in an agriculturally related field. What kind of responsibilities do we have to addressing questions like world hunger? And what's the role of a large public research university? What kind of social and public commitment do we want to make to that question? Whose responsibility is it to care about globally scaled issues around hunger and food production? And you see that as a particular commitment here at the University of Minnesota. Norman Borlaug, who was a graduate of the U of M's General College, a Nobel laureate. He was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize. He's considered the father of what we call the Green Revolution, for those of you who've heard of that, with the idea that developing certain plant varieties that are resistant to disease, that are kind of a monoculture paradigm where you grow a lot of the same thing, and you use chemical inputs, and it's mechanized as opposed to a lot of hand labor. That paradigm of the Green Revolution has had a dramatic impact on the way that agriculture is practiced internationally. And of course, it set up a bunch of different dynamics about who provides those inputs, where do development dollars internationally fit into the dynamic of these relationships between private firms, public agricultural research, as well as privately funded agricultural research, and many countries around the world who were interested in agricultural development using this Green Revolution paradigm. There's also a pretty healthy critique of that, which I'm sure some of you here are aware of, which is what happens when you dramatically transform the paradigms around the way that agriculture is practiced. What does it mean when you create a monocultural paradigm of what kinds of food is produced and what that means for local economies, what it means for creating, for addressing the issue of food self-sufficiency versus export economies of agricultural products and the like. And so you see these two competing worldviews about how we want to feed ourselves and how we want food to be produced. And there are advantages and disadvantages to all of them. There's a lot of complicated questions in the local foods movement or the locavore movement that we haven't really asked. And it will be interesting to see the role that land-grant universities can play in helping us think through those tough questions. What role do disciplines like the social sciences and humanities in a land-grant institution have to play? So they too are embodying the land-grant mission as disciplines, contributing to the way we produce food and how we feed people. And at the same time, the agricultural sciences, which are funded primarily by federal and private sources, there's not much state and support left, and not a whole lot of federal support either, what role and what work do the agricultural and food sciences need to do to ask themselves some tough questions about some of the paradigms that they're getting critiqued about from people who might align themselves with this good food or this new food movement. So,
how do universities come to be invested in feeding the world, and what is the legacy of that investment? That is a really big question, and I thought, Lord, how on earth could I answer this question? I'm just a humble rural sociologist, and so I'm going to give you first, I'd like to give you a little bit of background on those 3 land-grant universities that I've been involved with, because this really contextualizes anything that I would have to contribute to the discussion today. I hold a PhD in development sociology, and that training took place in a department of rural sociology. But there is something of a distinction there. This was at Cornell in the late 1980s and early 90s. But in addition to working at Cornell, I've been at 2 other land-grant institutions, at Iowa State for about 7 years, and now for about 6 years at Penn State University. And I think that, this range of experience, for me, really complicates this discussion. For one thing, there's the East Coast Midwest land-grant context. While Maggie was telling us about sort of the larger background of the land grant, and certainly giving us a lot of detail about the Minnesota context, I think it's really important to underscore that it is not a monolithic land grant, and that it really is quite variable across the country. And then there's also important contrasts in being at Cornell, which is an Ivy League, but also a land grant hybrid. At Penn State, which is a land grant institution, it came out of the old historical Farmers High School, but today people on campus are very quick to admonish you not to think of it as not to talk of it as a state-supported school. We're in fact just state-related, given that it's 14% and declining support from the state at the moment. Iowa State, when I was there in 1997, I don't know what the situation is now, had a much more substantial proportion of its dollars coming from state appropriations. And I think all of this makes for some real differences, in addition to some of the agro-geographical contrasts across these states. So I want to give you a little bit of sense of what I've seen over the years at these 3 institutions, maybe to again create a little bit more variegation in terms of what we're talking about with the Feed the World paradigm. When I went to Cornell, and being in a development sociology program housed in rural sociology, there was huge attention to international agriculture and development. And in the context of development sociology, the work was really critical. And it was premised, however, on political economic perspectives and increasingly political ecology perspectives. And my peers, including Jim Harkness in the audience, were conducting peasant livelihood studies in Indonesia, looking at the incorporation of contract labor into global fresh fruit and vegetable commodity chains, looking at the implications of Three Gorges development in China, the landless workers movement in Brazil. And so it was very much situated within a development framework. Many of our colleagues were also looking at these issues in a domestic context, and so development sociologists were working in New York dairy communities, dairy being a significant agricultural sector, and trying to understand the dynamics of restructuring, which were not simply people leaving the farm because there were better things going on in the city. There was profound restructuring going on in agriculture, and particularly in the dairy sector through the 1980s with the herd buyout and so on. And so sociologists were looking at questions of how civic and community structures might support other models of agriculture that might be less intensification in the dairy sector. Now, there were certainly corners of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences that may have talked more explicitly in terms of this language of feeding the world, but I remember more colleagues in those departments using terminology like technology, innovation, efficiency, and modernization, and occasionally this would come up in conversations with people in nutritional sciences. For me, in development sociology, when people talked about technology, innovation, efficiency, and modernization, it was simply a foil to our own energetic debates in development sociology about the forms and impacts of capitalist development in agriculture, whether it is in the United States or in countries overseas. It was a foil to our discussions about the environmental and social equity impacts of rapid technological change in agriculture. I think the thing I'd really point out, though, is that when I was, at least at that first land grant, the discussion was really not so much about food. Food was sort of the next step on. We weren't studying food per se. It was really very much centered around production and the social relations of production in agriculture and in agricultural livelihoods. Now, I then went to Iowa State, and I do remember many explicit and implicit, more shadowed encounters with discourses on feeding the world. When I interviewed there at my meeting with the dean, he listened very patiently to my account of my emerging research agenda on sustainable agriculture and local food systems development, agri-food movements, and so on. And then he leaned over and he asked, as if to put me on track, "That's all very nice, but I really want to know what ideas you have for getting farmers to adopt new technologies and practices the university is developing and ensuring public acceptance." And his comments really encapsulated for me what Philip Lowe at the University of Newcastle calls an end-of-pipe role for social scientists, often in the land grants, and particularly so for sociologists and rural sociologists, if those they be. The point is that the university has determined important technologies to develop, one seen as pivotal for modernizing and competing in historically important agricultural industries within states. And what a social scientist is to do is to tell the university, tell the production scientists, the agricultural engineers, how to get farmers on board. Now, I don't believe that the dean, as I try to think back on this, actually uttered the phrase feeding the world, but with hindsight, I think I can see that his perspective was woven into a particular agricultural social science research agenda that he was articulating, and it was this notion of being a support player, a handmaiden, in effect, assisting with the social engineering that will allow us to feed the world. Now, that said, that is my sort of entry to Iowa State. And I should say, too, that this was, the job I had there was not an extension sociologist. I was a head of research and teaching appointment, but this notion of what social science was about, at least in the College of Agricultural Sciences, was very much pervasive. In contrast to that vignette, I do have to also offer a ringing memory I have of Feed the World discourse, but from the other side. This was in the very exciting times with activities at the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture that many of you may be familiar with. And I can remember any number of admonishments issued, in particular by Rich Perot, who many of you may know, who runs the local and regional food systems groups and initiatives at the Leopold Center. And at workshops he would say, what we need to do is pull back from trying to feed the world and pay more attention to feeding Iowa. And so you see that kind of tension around particular understandings of what the mission of that particular land grant is about, and a sort of rearguard maneuver to try to pull that in. And certainly, there have been extraordinary successes with that through the Leopold Center, but the institution overall remains one that addresses both sides of that equation. And I'm going to fast forward to Penn State, where I've been working for about 6 years. And when I was invited to the symposium, I scratched my head and thought, why am I hearing people talking about feeding the world? And again, not exactly in those terms, but I do think the language of feeding and a global purview are very much in place. But it's rendered differently, and I think this is partly because of Penn State being a geographically differently located institution, having a very different kind of agriculture. Yes, dairy is significant, but we're not the top dairy state. We're number one in mushrooms, but there's a variety of other things, and it's actually a fairly diversified agriculture. And it is also, it's a big food processing state. It's potato chips, that kind of thing. But in any case, as I thought about this feeding question, I'm struck by ways that it's coming to the fore because my college, the College of Agricultural Sciences, is in the midst of a crushing budgetary crisis right now. We're in the midst of a restructuring of the college, which is not at all uncommon for land-grant colleges of agricultural sciences. We're doing it a little bit late. We have a new dean on board. And I'm struck by how, as the college positions itself within the university overall, and also within the state, trying to make a case for what we're about, that it's often in terms of feeding, but it's not feeding the world. There's a lot of talk about feeding the future. And this is interesting. I see this framing in some ways looking both outward and inward. The outward part is very much an embrace of what's going on right now in terms of much more heated debate and discussion about the specter of global food insecurity and the reasons for global food insecurity in light of climate change, bioenergy development, declining public investment, and so on and so forth, population growth, geopolitical interests. But the inward piece of this feeding the future may speak to how, as a college, my institution is talking about we feed our future in a time of public investment, and that we're looking for support from the state by speaking to that way of, or to that need that we have to feed our future for institutional survival. And so that's is part of an inward institutional piece. Now, I wanted to share one thing sort of related to my college and sort of the discussions in the administration that I think captures some of the difficulties of working with this notion of feeding the world. And this maybe speaks to some of the disciplinary tensions, misconnections, misalignments in how disciplines perceive feeding the world-related issues. And I'm going to take as my point of reference a book some of you may be familiar with, some of you may like it, some of you may hate it, but it's one that's captured some attention. It's this book entitled Enough: Why the World's Poorest Starve in an Age of Plenty by Roger Thoreau and Scott Kilman. Well, last November I read within a week 2 reactions to this book that for me capture some of the challenges in working through and reconciling notions of feeding the world. And one of the reactions was, I should say a little bit about the book. It's a book by 2 journalists. They take Borlaug's Green Revolution as a laudable starting point. So they're very, very positive about that legacy in ways that Maggie had described, but then proceed to discuss the intractability and the likely continuation of the hunger and food crisis in Africa. And one of the positions is very much favoring biotech advances as one solution to the problem, but at the same time these authors take on the food aid industry, U.S. farm subsidies, ethanol incentives, the Western donor community, activists. They're very down on GM, anti-GM activists, and they also take on African political leaders. You may like it, you may hate it, but what I found interesting is that my dean, who is now a blogger, wrote about it, and he said, I quote, "It is a thought-provoking and sobering look at how complex the food system really is, and it makes the reader stop to think a little more about the interplay between the global and the local." Okay, so hang on to that. Well then, 2 days later, I read a review of this book in one of my disciplinary journals, Contemporary Sociology, which does reviews of all kinds of books, and it was a review that just excoriated this book, and I'm going to quote here. "Beyond its accessibility, it is a work almost wholly bereft of merit. They claim to present an innovative perspective on world hunger, while simultaneously resisting complex theory." And here's my divided response. When I read the sociologist review, the sociologist in me winced, and I had to agree with that account. They did not talk about Sidney Mintz and Sweetness and Power. They had not cited any of the, really the cutting-edge global theorists. But at the same time, the College of Ag Sciences sociologist in me, and this is the pragmatist looking for openings and how we change the conversation or enlarge the conversation in my college, thought, but the dean read this book and he got some of the points, and this is getting him to think about things in different ways, and that's all potentially to the good, whatever the weaknesses or the flaws of this particular book. And to the extent that it maybe opens the conversation about structural and institutional contexts that makes those of us working in College of Ag Sciences, and particularly some who may not be reading any social science at all, just begin to think that technological solutions only could be unwise and maybe dangerous. Well, that's perhaps a good thing. And so, I therein give you my kind of divided reaction, the difficulty of disciplinary allegiances, and then also the requirement to be doing something within a College of Agricultural Sciences with colleagues who are all over the map in terms of their own disciplinary orientations and their own interpretations of a 21st century land-grant mission. I have some other things about this Feed the World paradigm, if it exists or not, and I'm not completely sure it's as rigid or monolithic as perhaps some of you think. But what I'd like to do is maybe leave that, and we'll see if that comes up in the conversation. But I did want to just take a moment for us to maybe scrutinize these terms in the phrase feeding the world. I mean, that's the way my mind tends to work. I was an English major before I was a sociologist, and maybe that's why. But when you consider the meanings laid on to this term feeding, if we take that one and then also think about the term the world, it's a transitive verb, so it's all about giving, producing, providing, serving food. And in that, I think we have to really focus on the kind of relationship between the feeder and the one being fed. And as with most social relationships, feeding may not always be as simple and as straightforward as it initially seems. There are certainly these connotations of caring and nurturing, of altruism and charity. But as sociologist Marjorie DeVoe has pointed out in her classic work, Feeding the Family, the social organization of caring, and specifically in the ongoing, necessary, and unpaid material and emotional labors by which women often ensure their families are fed, it's fraught with very subtle power dynamics. It is not a clean and simple story. Feeding is not a very innocent term. Feeding others may or may not have genuinely helpful intentions. The outcomes, too, may not match the stated intentions. And then, of course, there's all those unintended consequences, which we as academics should be attuned to. So the very term feeding, I think, needs some clarification. Feeding what and feeding how are details that get very much glossed over when we just talk about feeding the world. And then this term, the world, I have to confess, it really bothers me. It is chummy, it's neutral, it's a flattening term, as in we are the world. And there's this interesting veneer of inclusiveness. We may be feeding people in Sudan, Sumatra, or Skokie, Illinois, or maybe it's feeding ourselves. That's increasingly what we're talking about with home provisioning and some aspects of the local food movement. But which others in the world actually receive the immediate benefit? I mean, that's a huge issue in food aid and trade that needs far more scrutiny, and perhaps the longer-term burdens associated with such feeding. So the great global glossing obscures emerging facts and lingering complexities and consequences that are experienced on the ground, and I think we really have to unpack that term, the world, if that's what we're going to be talking about today.
And I'm kind of the ringer on this panel because I'm not at a land-grant institution. In fact, I think if you ask the average person at Indiana University what our role is in feeding the world, the answer you would hear is, that's not our job. We think about feeding the world, but we don't actually feed anybody. So I think I'll take this role as the ringer and run with it a little bit. And I want to start by relating something that I learned in an unexpected place. I thought I knew something about the role of the university in feeding the world. Although I'm now at a non-land-grant institution, Indiana University, I have worked at land-grant colleges. I've spent several years at New Mexico State. I was out of academia and I worked as a consumer of agricultural knowledge for the U.S. Agency for International Development. I spent several years doing applied research with the Energy and Resources Group at Berkeley. So I always chafe at this kind of non-applied side of my own university. Nevertheless, it wasn't until last year that I really thought more about the general relationship of all universities to rural life. And this was while I was setting up a farm internship program for our liberal arts students to go and spend 6 to 8 weeks during the summer working on a real farm in Indiana. And the farmer I've been working with, Adam Moody, is a 4th generation farmer near, his farm is near Greencastle. He runs a kind of pastured chicken and hog operation, and he's got 3 meat stores scattered around Indianapolis where he, some of his family do the butchering. And he related to me how since he's started to change his pasturing methods and change his orientation in his agriculture, he's gotten a lot of opposition and a lot of kind of nasty comments from people in his town who don't really have a lot of tolerance for people who are not doing corn and soybeans rotations. And it's not like Adam is a kind of strange person. He's a fundamentalist Christian, and he's a fourth-generation farmer, and his family's been there for a long time. And I asked him, so why do you think people are so opposed? And he said, well, think about it. Take a rural town, and every year take the brightest kids from high school and ship them off, never to return again. And he said, do that for 4 generations and look at who's left. And suddenly I started to realize that one of the historical roles of the university has been to get people off the farm. Whatever we say, there's a kind of implicit agenda that as agriculture develops, we're going to rationalize the countryside. The surplus workers are going to go to the city. Remember, when the land-grant colleges were founded, way more than 70% of the US population was on the farm. And today, after all these years of agricultural education, it's down to about 2%. So we're doing a pretty good job of sucking people out of the countryside and spewing them into the city. And in fact, when I worked for USAID, I worked on a scholarship program where we collected the brightest young farmers from all over the country of Belize, and we sent them off to schools in the US for 1-, and 2-, and 3-year training. And when we came back, every single one of them got an office job. And we weren't really developing agriculture. We were developing an agricultural bureaucracy, and we were helping the Ministry of Agriculture staff itself with people educated in agriculture, but we sure weren't helping agriculture. We were taking the best farmers and taking them out of agriculture. And I think the whole notion that the land-grant colleges are founded on, which is economies of scale, improved technology, and more efficiency so that you can cut down the amount of labor per acre. If you look at what the effects of that technology is, it's to remove people from the land. And unfortunately, it's hard to get across to a lot of development economic types that our problem in a place like Belize is not getting more people off the land and getting them to move to the city because there are no jobs for them in the city. So getting prices really low and squeezing the maximum amount per hour of labor is a very good program for getting people off the land. And I think that we have to kind of own up to the fact that the university plays a central role in doing that. Now, second, I want to talk about Cartesian dualism. The state of Indiana, where I live, has a university which could have been designed by the hand of Descartes. The head is in Bloomington and the hands are at Purdue. And the people at Purdue are supposed to do practical things with their hands, and they're supposed to be concerned about the real world. And in Bloomington, we're supposed to be thinking high thoughts. And we're supposed to be artistic, and we're supposed to be doing abstract kinds of science, and developing pure knowledge, and not getting our hands dirty if we don't even have hands. And there's this kind of politics of knowledge that we have a lot of cultural capital, and we don't get paid as much as they get paid at Purdue. They have more economic capital, to use Bourdieu's terminology. And then we reproduce those same divisions in the university, where the practical schools get the crummy buildings and have low status, so the School of Health, Physical Education, and Recreation is kind of stuck around the pool in a bunch of overheated rooms, And the math department, where they think a lot of high thoughts, has walnut paneling and coffered ceilings and oil paintings of famous mathematicians. So here we are at Indiana University trying to put together a food studies program. So there are some, so here at IU we have a food studies program. At Purdue, they have the Center for Ingestive Science. And we both claim to be multidisciplinary. I've actually been invited to the ingestion place to give a talk next year. But it is pretty much dominated by people who work in food science and whose goal is to get people to eat more of something and not necessarily to think about why. Whereas we don't really have very many people interested in getting anybody to do anything, but we ask why every single day. And I think in some ways it's a kind of a blessing that we are far from the agro-industrial complex and we have no funding. Because we're not really beholden to anybody, and we have political scientists, people in media and communications, English, anthropology, history, geography, folklore, ethics, the School of Public and Environmental Affairs, biology, nutrition, and human biology. And there is a little garden on campus. So we can actually go up there and see plants now and then and pick some food. But it's a very different approach to thinking about food and feeding the world from the kind of approach we would have if we were at a land-grant school. But on the other hand, we can choose who we want to come and talk to us. And this is probably reflected in our choice of speakers. In the last year, we've had Michael Pollan, Wes Jackson, Wendell Berry, Gary Naban, and Joel Salatin, which is not exactly a balanced roster in any representative from Cargill or Monsanto. Okay, the third topic I want to take up is what I saw happening in when I worked for USAID back in the early 80s. In the 70s, there was a burst in the development business of what was called basic needs. There was a lot of interest in helping people feed themselves. And there was a lot of investment by the United States through USAID and other organizations in developing agricultural research institutes and experimental farms in developing countries. And in training people to teach in those places and in basically giving them the capacity to do their own research and their own development and to develop their own extension systems. And there was some recognition that all those extension systems didn't have to be cookie cutters of the American extension system. Then Ronald Reagan was elected. And within 3 months, we had a directive from the main office in Washington that we were no longer to work with these local institutions in developing projects. So USAID had been funding CARDI, the Caribbean Agricultural Research and Development Institute, for 20 years. And overnight, we were told that we had to work with the private sector. And we were supposed to find a local private organization or company to partner with to run an agricultural development project. And there weren't any. So we got a retired Ministry of Agriculture official, and we paid him to start a private company. And then we gave him the contract to do the agricultural development project. And he hired a bunch of out-of-work extensionists. And what I've seen since then is a series of flip-flops where the development business goes through these kind of annual cycles of fashion, where, you know, this year it's small livestock, and next year it's microcredit, and you know, a year later it's let's export beef, and there is no longer any local institutional capacity to kind of look at these things critically. And this has been reproduced over and over and over again in many different parts of the world. I will just speak very, very briefly on my fourth point, and that is what I call topical butchery. And that is that if you look around the university, any university, and you ask who's responsible for food, it's like going to the federal government and saying who's responsible for food. Because there's 1,000 agencies responsible for food or have something to do with food. We don't study food. We divide the study of food up into as many pieces as we divide an animal up into before it goes to the supermarket, and we hand them off to specialists, each of whom becomes extremely good, and you know the saying, knowing more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing. And it's a parody because we never really get to that point of knowing everything about nothing, but we, in the process, have developed an approach to food that is so fragmented across disciplines and across so many different paradigms of human nature and ways of thinking about issues like choice and ways of thinking about the difference between individuals and social units, that when we get together to talk about food, we can have a common conversation as long as we stick to the food. But as soon as we start talking about humans, it turns out that the economist thinks that humans are individuals acting as rational actors, and the sociologist thinks that they belong to groups, and they act as in the interest of groups, and the anthropologist believes in all of them at the same time. We actually reproduce these same divisions within my own discipline. So we have economic anthropologists, and we have ecological anthropologists, and then we have the biological anthropologists and the nutritional anthropologists. And we have exactly the same kinds of problems talking to each other, which usually makes anthropology departments very fractious places. The one thing that has held my department together through some very difficult discussions and times has been the recognition that we are all interested in food. And that we can all relate what we do to food, and we try to keep our eyes focused on the food and not on the differences in our different paradigms. And I'm frustrated with the way, with disciplinarity. The disciplines were created in a different world. They were created in 19th century Germany. And the way that 19th century Germans divided the world up is not really functional in the 21st century. It just doesn't make any sense anymore. And you know, I've got colleagues in geography who are doing exactly the same thing I'm doing, but they're referring to a completely different literature, which says almost exactly the same thing that our literature says.
I know.
And we even refer to some of the same French people. So we can even agree on what French people we want to cite, but we live in kind of two separate worlds.
Are there any questions?
So, you know, maybe I'll be, since you were so wonderfully cheeky, I think I'll take the invitation. You know, so let me paint a probably gross exaggeration, but the idea, this ideal that somehow in some form more of us are going to become more food self-sufficient, that, you know, I have my garden on top of the roof, and I've got my cow grazing next to my garage, and I've got the chicken coop near the beehive but not too close, you know, and it's a permaculture thing, and I've replaced all my trees with fruit trees, and, you know, there's this big circle of life in my quarter-acre lot in the city because that's where I live. And I'm pretty involved in the urban food movement. You know, to what extent can we really be food self-sufficient? And if we have that kind of commitment, how many hours a day, a month, does that actually take? And I think this idealization of what it takes to really grow food, it's not 2 tomato plants and basil and the occasional experiment. I mean, you know, it's a whole other knowledge base, and it's not gardening, it's farming. It's a different thing. So if we're all talking about doing this, we all don't know what we're doing. I mean, there's a few of us who know what we're doing, and they become the rock stars on the blogs and, you know, the vignettes we see at all the big film festivals that we all go to with Fresh and Greenhorns and right. I mean, we're all down with all that stuff. And so I think one of the big questions is, are we really hoping that Walmart won't be Walmart anymore, but the food distribution system works as well, but at a smaller scale? But you know, so it's the trucks run on the local biodiesel to the farm 50 miles down the road, but there's enough farmers to do that, but none of us really want to do the farm labor. It's really hard work. And I don't think we've really acknowledged what it's going to take to feed ourselves at a food shed scale. We haven't made that one up yet. And is it moving from a supercomputer globalized food system to a laptop so it works the same way but it fits in our lap? Are we talking about reducing the scale of a big thing but having it work like that so most of us aren't growing? We're just cooking our, you know, shallots that are grown down the yard in our marble countertop kitchens and our convection ovens. Is that what we're doing? And maybe making mozzarella with our friends over really good wine on a Friday night or something. Or are we churning our butter, or are we actually out there milking the cows? So I think that naivete is something that we haven't really addressed yet. What does it take to feed a region? What kind of agricultural system do we really want? And but we all don't want the dirt under our fingernails. That's a tough one. And the price question, and that of course is a federal question because we've always paid somebody to grow food for us. And what kind of gains can we actually make in terms of a redesign of the food system along that scale of intimacy that we really want if we can't crack the federal subsidy nut about who gets paid to grow what. And then if we've kind of reduced the number of farmers to 2%, if we want this different vision, who's going to do it for us? So there's a few questions like that. One of the questions that families need to ask is, do we have time for this new kind of labor when we're just trying to keep afloat economically? And that question applies to everything, you know, most of us, whether we're profoundly low income or moderately low income, what used to be called middle class or whatever. I think that's another big question you have to ask.
It sounds like the new tyranny. It really does.
It's also very ahistorical. If you go back to the 30s, there were hundreds of thousands of school gardens.
Yes, yes.
It was a huge movement in this country. Before, we haven't even gotten close to matching how many school gardens there were in the United States in 1930. And if you really want to read a kind of skeptical take on going back to the land, and I'm old enough to remember, you know, people who left my college to go back to the land and be independent small farmers. But E.B. White, who wrote Charlotte's Web, went back to live on a farm in Maine in 1940. And he wrote a book about it, about what it's like to really run a farm. And he wrote a review in the New Yorker while he was up there about a book that was published in 1940 that was convincing Americans to leave the city and go back and live on the farm. His comment at the beginning of the review is, "This is a very dangerous book." If people follow its advice, they're going to suffer because farming is not easy. And it's nothing like the life that is depicted in these pages. So, and he does it in such a charming way. And he really valued rural life, but he accepted it for what it was.
The real challenge, though, is for particularly colleges of agriculture to understand that their constituency cannot just be farmers. There just aren't enough of them, and the historical trend, given the way agriculture developed because of the modernist project, was a proliferation of, an increase in size of a diminishing number of farmers and a lot of power in the hands of those farmers, and they are not representative of the population at large. And there's a certain amount of clout that they have at the state level, but it is an alienation of so many other stakeholder groups, if you will, in the variety of states in which land grants reside. And so there has to be a rethinking of constituencies. It's a really difficult thing, though, because at Penn State now there's a lot of talk about our stakeholder groups, but there's sort of our core stakeholder groups who are that historical. It's the commodity groups, it's the Farm Bureau, and there's an understanding that it has to be much larger, but that's a very difficult thing to do in terms of rocking those historical relationships, entrenched privileges that are part of those relationships. But there may well be space for people to work with, and I think to update Bailey for the 21st century. It seems like there are people that are trying to do that.
I would say I'm not sure, Randy, because I was just looking at Governor Walker's budget last night next door, and he's talking about just completely closing down the UW Medical School, right? $143 million cut. I know the bloodletting that we're seeing at universities around the country at the state levels because of the state support, right? So in the face of our hope that maybe we could remake the land grant to be a little bit more regionally responsive or paradigmatically diverse or feeding eaters, not just serving farmers, they're caught between a rock and a hard place, and it's really hard in Minnesota. I mean, what do we have here? We've got Cargill, we've got Syngenta, we've got General Mills. I mean, we're not just the carbohydrate belt crop-wise. We really, are sort of umbilical in terms of the center of a lot of agribusiness, and so that dictates a lot. We both have the commodity groups asking and expecting to be able to set the agenda, as well as a lot of industrial partners. So that also complexifies things for us at the University of Minnesota. I would say it's a lot to ask of an institution where we only make a small investment at the state level to not have to chase a lot of research dollars just to keep the doors open. Right? I mean, there's tuition dollars, and you can see we've raised tuition 95% over the course of Brunich's presidency because of the budget cuts. So students are paying a lot more. Federal dollars and state dollars to support agriculture research have dropped precipitously. So that means faculty have to chase a lot of federal grants as well as private support just to be able to continue their research. So how is it that we ask them to take on this project of redesigning the food system? Can they play the role this time that they played for us last time? We gave them the public investment to do that for us last time. We're not giving it to them this time. So does that ultimately mean we have to figure it out at a community level? Add to that the complicated organizational culture and resistance to change because they're used to working with the partners that they're used to working with. It's a really hard time in higher education. It's a really hard time in land-grant country. It's a really hard time and an exciting time in terms of the creativity and innovation and calls for systems change in the food movement. How much of it we have to figure out ourselves by me copying what my next door neighbor is trying to do, and how much of it we can ask our public institutions that are not very public anymore. I'm not sure. We have some very tough decisions to make, and electing people like Wisconsin did is the opposite solution to what we can't expect public institutions to do that when we're looking at these kind of major cuts. So we have some soul searching to do as a nation about what we want and where we want to ask our governments at the state and federal level to make their investments. That's up to us.
I'll try to be brief. I think I'll follow Maggie in trying to put this in the broad context of the broader culture. And in the context of the broader culture, everything becomes left-right. Everything becomes too polarized into two positions. And I see this happening already in the food movement. I think it is a regrettable, horrible thing. But I look at some of the publications of the Farm Bureau, which are treating this alternative food movement as the enemy. A bunch of misinformed idiots who don't know anything and who are being led astray by people like Michael Pollan.
By a San Francisco latte drinking.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's just full of stereotypes. And then you look at the way that farmers are stereotyped in this culture, and the kind of 200 years of treating rural people like bumpkins has an effect. And the kind of arrogant superiority that you hear from some people in the new food movement, who think that these are just a bunch of deluded poisoners in the pay of giant agribusiness trying to give us all cancer. And this kind of polarizing...
And make us fat.
Oh, and make us fat. It's their fault. And this kind of finger pointing and arm waving and then feeding it into this industrial mill of our political process that takes every issue and turns it into right and left and gets them fighting with each other. And for that to happen to the food movement is just, it's so regrettable, and it's such a horrible thing to watch. But I'm afraid we're watching it happen in slow motion right now, and that it's going to become, the positions are going to become parodies. And unfortunately, there's lots of money flying around to fund polarization. And for some people in the land-grant schools, I think this is a way of building support and keeping the money coming in from private businesses. And I think on the left, there's just a lot of free-floating anger and angst and a lot of hostility towards established institutions that is getting focused right now on food. And that's not the best environment.